We are very excited to be having Caio Araújo present his work today. Caio is a postdoc fellow at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand. And today he is presenting his work, Pink Socialism, the Itineraries, Queer Itineraries in Post-Colonial Mozambique. So we're very excited to hear the work. Caio is going to present for 20 minutes and then we'll do a Q&A session. So Caio, I give over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, the History Workshop, for this opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen. Just a second. Can you please let me know if it's all right, Sapana?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my work, which is, as I mentioned in the paper, it's very much in progress. It's a first draft, so I'm really welcoming comments and critiques. So I want to start by saying a few words about where the paper is coming from. I've been going on and off to Maputo for the last few years, mostly to conduct interviews for our oral history project I've been leading in partnership with the Gala Queer Archive and the Governing Intimacies Project, which is based here at Wits University. The goal of the project was to create an archive, a queer archive that gathered narratives, experiences, and memories of queer people who live in Maputo today or who had lived in Lourenço Marques, as the city was called during the colonial period. So it is in this context that I went to interview Abdul, a gay man born in 1954. And that was quite an interesting experience. His home was full of memorabilia, from family portraits, religious symbols, posters, and all sorts of little things. And I was immediately struck by this Russian doll that he kept in his bookshelf. And in our conversation, he told me that the doll had been a gift from a former lover, a Russian boyfriend he had had back in the 80s. So the interaction and the little conversation about the doll opened the space to have a broader conversation about same-sex entanglements in the post-colonial moment in Mozambique. Entanglements that stretched from Maputo to the wider socialist world and leftist transnational communities. So in this presentation, I want to take the doll as a part of entry into the same-sex intimacies, which have been so far ignored in historical narratives of both queer cultures and socialist cultures in post-colonial Mozambique. So I'll focus in two kind of sets of vectors and situations, cooperantes and then Germans, and I will explain each of these. So this is another angle of the picture of the Russian doll. So the first part of the paper, for those of you who had the time to read the paper, the first part of the paper is titled Cooperantes, Parting as Queer World Making. And I basically want to queer the history of post-colonial Mozambique, which is a moment, as we all know, after political independence under Frelimo's leadership, Mozambique really realigned its international relations towards the socialist world, especially the Soviet Union and East Germany. And besides economic and diplomatic cooperation happening at several levels, this also included a wave of skilled personnel going to Mozambique to assist in post-colonial reconstruction. So this was a group of foreign and mostly white workers known as cooperantes, which means those who cooperate. And they were not necessarily citizens of socialist countries. They could also be leftists from the West. But still, I think they all shared a kind of ideological commitment to the socialist revolutionary project. And that's the reason why I include both Westerns and socialist nationals into this category. So some of my interlocutors in Maputo, they mentioned the role played by this group of men in keeping a hidden gay culture going in post-colonial Maputo. And now I'll just give you a very brief contextualization of post-colonial Maputo. I have argued in another paper that vibrant queer urban culture existed in Lourenço Marques, around the dock areas, in downtown, around the strips of nightclubs and bars, which was known at the cities as the very heart of the city's nightlife. After independence, many of these businesses were shut down as part of Frelimo's policy of moral cleansing of the city, which has already been studied at length by Benedito Machava, so I'm not going to really go into a lot of detail. But what I try to show is that these moral campaigns, they didn't fully eradicate spaces of same-sex socialization in post-colonial Maputo, but they fragmented them along racial and class divides. And part of that had to do with this new international clientele of business people, diplomats, and cooperantes. Even then, one of my interlocutors mentioned that interracial relationships across the class divides were not uncommon in this new international community. So Guto described practices of party planning in a context where goods were scarce. And I'm reading his quote. People with more means would bring the whiskey, the gin, beers. You bring something else, and we go to someone's house to have a braai. So Guto lived for many years in South Africa. So actually he used the term braai to describe these gatherings. If you were Mozambican, you had to have contacts because it wasn't easy to get hold of cash to buy from a store unless you were a foreigner. Guto is alluding to a moment known in public memory as Tempo de Fome, the times of hunger, when food shortage and a state rationing system made a scarcity of goods, including food and everyday necessities, a common experience for most of urban population in Maputo, urban and suburban as well. So considering that cooperantes and other international personnel had preferential access to food and alcohol, they did play a role in distributing resources across a growing network of queer sociability that existed around private parties. As elsewhere in Maputo, the gay party was a dense nodal point for friendships, romantic attachments, and sexual transactions. And of course, it also served as a site of community building and queer world making that was facilitated in this kind of act of being with, hanging out, drinking, and fucking. Differently than the white-only parties that existed in settler society before independence, what is distinctive and what is brought up in the interviews that I made about the gay parties in the 80s was their interracial and international character, which put together cooperantes and a growing Mozambican middle class. And Lily Havstad's work on the Mozambican middle class, the history of Mozambican middle class, is very interesting to understand this moment. So these were the types of parties that Abdul himself used to host at his flat. And when I asked him like who were going to those parties, he replied that it was a very mixed crowd, Mozambican friends alongside Americans, Portuguese, Italians. During the time, there were cooperantes more than anything else who were attending the parties. And I have a couple of pictures from Abdul's private archive of these parties. Let me just go back. Yeah. Friendships and romantic relationships also flourished outside this party space, but also in relation to the networks they made possible. So, and I think this is of relevance considering the constraints faced by different groups in this kind of international community. Abdul's memories, for example, of his relationship to a Russian it's quite revealing at the relationship that, produced this Russian doll in his apartment. Russian cooperantes, they lived in shared accommodation with other countrymen under the watchful eyes of supervisors, which made gay relationships very difficult and not sustainable in the long run. So I think that indicates that in addition to class, position, and race, national affiliation remain relevant in this context of socialist internationalism, especially considering queer practices and the possibility of meaningful relationships. I heard from several interviews of relationships between Mozambican and foreign men dating back from the 80s, some of which are still going today, some of which resulted in marriage. And obviously most of them are with cooperantes coming from the Western world, where the history of gay rights is very different than what transpired in the socialist bloc. So I think the case of the Russian cooperantes, they bring about the question of disciplinary cultures in this local. When I think about the local expressions of socialist internationalism, and that brings me back to the second part of the paper, where disciplinary cultures become quite important, and that has to do with Germans. So East Germany was one of Mozambique's closest international partners in the socialist world, coming only after the Soviet Union. In the 70s and 80s, ideas of solidarity and friendship materialized in a number of ways, but including the migration of thousands of Mozambican migrant workers to East Germany in numbers that are estimated between 15,000 and 20,000. The majority of them were men stationed in German towns to work in factories in different economic sectors. So in the last couple of decades, a lot of work actually has been done surrounding this case. A first approach in the scholarship had tended to focus on workers' experience of racial discrimination, of isolation in German society, and also to how they navigated disciplinary regimes in the factory setting. More recent studies have painted a broader and more nuanced picture, looking at how workers were successful in resisting social control and avoiding labor discipline, while also creating spaces for themselves in East Germany as migrant workers. Sexuality in general and same-sex practices in particular have remained very much understudied in this literature. Erika Lina points out that the international politics of good contact and friendship between Mozambique and Germany and East Germany excluded intimacy, as having sexual liaisons with Germans was on paper forbidden and could be grounds for contract termination and deportation. Obviously, he also shows that in practice, the situation was much different. Likewise, Nienhoff's work shows that German official policy tended to discourage interracial sexual contacts as being, which was portrayed as being against socialist morals, while also preaching abstinence and sexual discipline as qualities of a good Marxist. So the interviews that I did, they suggest that, despite all the attempts by the state and by the factory to control the time, the mobility, and the sexual practices of Mozambican workers, gay men, just as the straight workers that were there, which were studied by Alina and Nienhoff, they also managed to subvert and evade disciplinary regimes in and outside the space of the factory. I draw on a particular case, which, there were other cases as well, but in the paper I decided to focus on one particular case, which was a very lengthy, detailed life history, and it had more to work with. This is the case of Visa, who lived in Sangerhausen from 86 to 89, working in a rasp factory. And I just put a little map here for you to understand the distance between Sangerhausen and Berlin, because that becomes quite important in the story. So Issa's story, in a way, is similar to that of other workers in the sense that he really defied the disciplinary setup of the factory. He complained about the curfew, about the attempts to control their time, their mobility. He mentions that even to go to the local grocery store, they were escorted by a group of German guards. And he would say, and I'm quoting here, "We are not slaves, we are not goats, we are not pigs for you to be herding us." And so even if other co-workers also complained about the same, Issa, in his narrative, he reckoned that he had the biggest mouth in the sense that he voiced his grievances the most. This included not only saying things out loud, but also, acting against factory discipline. This included going out to nightclubs in Berlin regularly, and he used to go by train. That's why I show the train connection here. Spending the night with multiple friends, which is a word that he used to describe not only friendships, but also, fleeting romantic relationships. So here there's a quote from his interview. "I didn't sleep in the hostel. I'd leave the nightclub and go straight to the factory where I was working. I'd finish the day of work and I got out again. I didn't sleep in the hostel. There was an argument every day with management, and I say that I hadn't go there to Germany to be in prison. I had friends there in Berlin, so I'd sleep at their places." Issa's behavior were serious offenses, considering that informing factory management of one's whereabouts and securing permission to be out after the 8 p.m. curfew were required. And still, Alina's work has showed that even, despite a very strict code of conduct, transgressions were very common and punishment was very selective. So there were whole situations in which factory authority would go unexercised. And but I also want to suggest that perhaps Issa managed to escape punishment due to the social networks that he cultivated at the hostel. For example, on Sundays, he would cook for other workers. He said, they loved my food. He also engaged in sexual relationships, providing sexual favors when he felt like it. When I asked him if there were other gay men in the hostel, he replied, "There were no gays in the hostel, but all of them, when they were horny, they wanted me. There was no women there. The only woman was me. That's what happened, and I slept with them, no doubt." Issa managed to remain in Germany for 3 years until he was eventually deported in 1989. As he describes it, and I'm quoting, "I had to come back because I was too much of a bicha." Portuguese word for fag, has the same kind of meaning, and kind of reclaimed the reclamation of a slur, the way in which he uses it. After learning that he had to come back to Mozambique, Issa performed a less fugitive move. He ran away to Berlin, where he moved in with one of his friends. He enjoyed his life there until a very unfortunate situation. One night, 3 of the boyfriends that he had at the time, they showed up in the same club at the same time and got into a fight over him. In the middle of the confusion, he cut someone's face with a piece of glass. The police was called to the scene. He was arrested and then deported. So, and I'm now going towards the conclusion. So Issa remembers his time in East Germany with affection and disdain. Of course, he misses his friends. He remembers about his experiences very fondly. He seems to cherish a sense of freedom he managed to achieve by running away, refusing to follow discipline, and ultimately transgressing the moral boundaries of the state socialist project. But he remains uninterested in organized forms of political mobilization as other Germans, so other workers who are now in Mozambique, who still protest against the treatment that they received in Germany, and then after they arrived in Mozambique. I was very interested to try to understand this position, in which, by the one hand, there is obviously a critique there, but on the other hand, it's a critique that is uninterested in conventional forms of political mobilization. And I think cases such as Issa, they demand that we recalibrate our intellectual vocabularies. A lot of the work on the agency and resistance of Mozambican workers in East Germany, they tend, these acts of agency and resistance, they tend to be understood within the dominant political culture. So, you know, within the language of state socialism, international solidarity, and workers' rights. And Issa's narrative refuses to be incorporated into these more conventional modes of agency and resistance. So in the paper, I try to understand this through a grammar of fugitivity and refusal, engaging the work of Tina Kemp. So just to conclude, because I'm running out of time, Kemp proposes that we refuse binary notions of agency versus subjection to think instead with a grammar of fugitivity and with quotidian practices of refusal to stay put or to stay in one's designated place. So I would argue that in Nissa's case, whoring can be understood as such quotidian form of refusal, which disturbs the sexual morals of the socialist state, but also transgresses the closely policed boundaries put in place through socialist solidarity between the host society and the migrant worker. So sleeping around, cultivating multiple boyfriends, or going to the club regularly were all practices in Nissa's queer repertoire, which allowed him to refuse the disciplinary regimes of the factory and of the state, and to subvert his subject position. So at the end of the day, he was no victim of the Cold War, but he used the circuits of mobility socialist solidarity put in place to his own advantage, mobilizing queer practices of fugitivity and refusal to create a space of his own, taking the everyday as a site of freedom. And I think I'll conclude there. Something that I didn't include in the presentation or in the paper, but now I realize that perhaps there should have been a footnote, is that obviously when I speak about whoring, there is no kind of, you know, moralist gaze to this practice, and it's used very much in the kind of reclamation for empowerment intention that is, you know, other words such as queer, for example. And I think I will stop here. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. You can raise your hand or you can just speak. So I see a hand. Zuko, go.
Hi everyone. Hi, Caio. Thank you so much for your presentation and your lovely paper, which I enjoyed reading. I just have a question about kind of the relation that you map out between kind of Mozambican workers and between kind of migrant workers and kind of just these other national relations within these spaces that they frame. And I was wondering whether you've thought or think about, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of just like exploitative kind of just like dynamics at play. And part of why I asked this is kind of the work that you draw from kind of just like Tina Kemp, and thinking about the object and kind of just like the moving object, and whether or not kind of objecthood does in some way kind of, I don't know, speak to how we understand those dynamics. And another reason why I asked this is that at some point Essa asks, says that when he's lying, he says that he was there, referring to prison, when in fact he's at a lover's place. And kind of just like, how do we think about these sites of freedom that are being made even at that time? Thank you.
Anyone else? We have a comment in the chat that says, please can you share the Tina Kemp reference, and great stuff. Okay, and then we have another question from Njogo that says, can you say a bit more about your methods, in particular, how and why is it Abdul seems to open up to you quickly about his sexuality through the conversation about the doll? Okay, so we have 2 questions and a comment. I think you can answer back and we'll do the next round afterwards.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll answer the method question first, because that's very straightforward. So as I was saying in the beginning, all the interviews that I mentioned in this paper and in other papers, they have been conducted as part of this kind of archival making project that I have been very, very fortunate to be able to carry out with support from Governing Intimacies, the Governing Intimacies Project at WITS and the Galler Queer Archive. So all the interlocutors, they were contacted because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So he already knew that we would speak about this. There wasn't really an issue of having to open up a conversation about sexuality, because that was very much the purpose of the talk. And in particularly in the case, I mean, I couldn't really go into details in the presentation, but I think Abdul's kind of motivation to be part of the project is really to kind of produce history, because I asked him like why he has amazing private archive with photographs from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the couple of pictures that I showed here are from gay parties that he hosted at his apartment in the 80s. He has like dozens, if not hundreds of pictures. And I asked him, you know, like, what is your motivation to keep so many pictures? And he answered, because it's history. And I think it was a little bit the motivation in giving the interview. Like in his case, that's not the case with everyone, of course. But I think in his case, that was his motivation, and he was very glad to be able to share his story. Yeah. So this goes for method. And also, I mean, speaking a little bit more about methods, the interviews were structured in the sense that because this was a project that intended to build an archive, it was important to have some sort of coherence across all interviews. But they weren't, you know, that strict. So obviously, you know, the interviews, they don't have questions about socialist internationalism. That was something that had to do with his biography. So yeah. Regarding the other question, yeah, thank you so much. This is such some that I really have been thinking about, and as you mentioned, that the question of power and objectification is quite crucial in obviously all literature on fugitivity, on refusal. As we know, the term fugitivity has a kind of intellectual genealogy that goes back to Atlantic studies and slavery studies. But in the case of Tina Kempt, what I find so fascinating is that she's engaging with this literature and with this debates from the point of view of the contemporary African diaspora, from the point of view of cultural representation, modalities of discourse, of archival making as well. So those are the reasons why I thought that it really resonated with the context I was looking at. And it did so because, as I was saying, a lot of the interviews about the experience of migrant workers in Germany, they really go to the place of, you know, racism, of exploitation at the factory setting, of like mistreatment, and all this kinds of the kind of migrant worker condition. And Issa himself, he referred to, and I think that is in the paper, but I didn't mention in the presentation, but he refers to the Mozambican migrant workers as former slaves. So this is the word that he uses to kind of emphasizes the power relations that were at play in the kind of this project of socialist solidarity. What I find very interesting is that the literature tends to look at workers' resistance through, you know, the kinds of protocols of solidarity themselves. For example, Eric Alina, he has a beautiful chapter in which he describes how migrant workers, they would write letters, write petitions to the German state to complain about their condition in the factories. And they would use the language of socialist solidarity to justify the reasons why they were complaining. What I find interesting about Issa's case is that this kind of conventional politics is not there at all, but there is still a politics happening. And I think, and that's where I find that the notion of refusal in the quotidian and the everyday is so useful in this case. And I mean, I think I'll stop here because I want to give more time to other questions, if there are.
Great, thanks, Caio. I see Sapna has dropped out with her internet problems, but she should be back in a moment. But there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, from Pamela Gupta. She says, great presentation. Can you say more about the speciality of queerness in colonial Rollins or Mark? I think you'll do a better job of pronouncing that, and how it maintained or shifted to different spaces in post-colonial Maputo. So there's that question, and then Ariana has her hand up.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Caio. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask you a bit more about kind of state responses to same-sex relationships, both in Mozambique and the GDR. You mentioned in the paper that, you know, that punishment was actually it doesn't seem that it was sort of meted out so systematically, and ultimately in the story of Essa, it seems it's more, you know, the fight at the club and the police getting called in rather than his sexual orientation that lead to his deportation. So I just wondered about, you know, whether this was seen as sexual deviancy, and whether what the kind of official response, whether people were aware and how they responded to it. And I wondered if at all same sex was seen linked to HIV and the spread of HIV at the time.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ariana. Perhaps, Caio, you can take those two questions, the one in the chat and then this one from Ariana.
Yeah, great. Asking, sorry, I think I'll answer Pamela's question first. So what I've been trying to do, I think the question of queer geographies is really important and how they shift, and especially considering that I couldn't really go deep into it in the presentation, but in the paper I try to show how the nightlife that existed downtown in Lourenço Marques, that a lot of historians have written about as being a theater of sexual solicitation, was also a very queer space. And it was also a space around which queer networks built across racial and class dividers, because I've done interviews in which people that was a space in which a lot of people could go to, even people from that didn't live in middle class areas, elite areas. They still managed to inhabit this space in different forms. And then after independence, this whole social space is it suffers a crackdown, as Benedito Machado has argued. And then what happens in some of my interviews, you can really see how queer spaces fragment around private parties and certain clubs that now exist in more elite areas. That is obviously not to say that there were no relationship between different there was no like interracial or relationships across the class divide, but I do think that there was a little bit more of surveillance around these leisure spaces that had to do with what Benedito Machado described as Frelimu's moralism around nightlife, around drinking, around drugs and partying and all of that. There was really celebration of discipline, of work, and a kind of otherization of everything that queer lifestyle for certain people would represent. So I think you can see how that politics translates in the urban space, I think. And then, yeah, thanks, Ariana, for this is such a interesting question. And I think you're right. I don't think punishment was a matter of sexuality at all. And I hope I didn't suggest that. It was really about factory discipline and labor discipline. So, but what I try to show is that the modalities of transgressing the boundaries, or the modalities of disrespecting discipline, were different from the point of view of a queer subject such as Issa, and that's what I try to explore. That's what I try to explore in the paper. And then I think you're totally right. The deportation case didn't have to do with sexuality. It had to do with the police case and the fight and violence and so on. But I still find very interesting that Issa tells the story as in like, I had to come back because I was too much of a fag, So this becomes part of the oral history narrative. And I think that's what I try to work with. Now, in the paper, I mentioned it a little bit, that one of the reasons why I decided to work on this specific topic is that I actually find quite surprising that people working on the history of Mozambican migrant workers in East Germany haven't looked or mentioned same-sex sexuality at all, considering that there is actually quite a lot of literature on queerness in East Germany. You have authors that will argue that there was a sexual revolution in East Germany. East Germany decriminalized homosexuality at a very early stage if you compare with other countries of the socialist bloc. So I really don't think that the same-sex aspect was the aspect that was problematic here, but it was more the kind of interracial sexual relationship between host society and the migrant body. And then the scholarship looking at this, they really highlight how there was this, as I mentioned, having sexual liaisons with Germans was an offense to the kind of terms of the agreement. In spite of that, Erika Lina's work has shown that obviously it happened, of course it would happen. And there is some interesting work done on the children that were born from this kind of socialist solidarity in East Germany. So that's a work that is still ongoing. Regarding the HIV question, thank you so much for this question. I wanted to have included that in the paper, but then I realized it would have been too much. And I think that is a crucial question when we are thinking about oral histories of post-coloniality in Mozambique from a queer perspective. And I say that because the interlocutors that I interviewed that are from a particular age, so you know, the ones that I mentioned in this paper, for instance, in the conversations, they're telling their stories, but they are also referring to this huge network, queer networks that they had in their youth in the 80s, most of which has passed. And you know, there is this great sense of historical laws attached to the generational struggle with the question of HIV. And I really wanted to mention that in this paper, because another case that I would have mentioned of a queer Mozambican worker in East Germany, Rui, he unfortunately passed of what they call the disease of the century. So I know of his history in East Germany through the narratives of his friends. You know what I mean? So I think all this brings very important and pertinent questions to queer histories and queer archival making. What do you do when you have a group of people who are no longer, but they are constantly being brought about in interviews and you know, and in people's narratives. Interestingly, I asked Issa about HIV when he was in Germany, and he mentioned that he had never heard of it before he came back to Mozambique. And then in my research, I actually found out that East Germany really didn't have a HIV problem until unification. It was the numbers were extremely small, and it wasn't really part of public debate, but you know, public health and all of that. So that really kicks in upon his return in the 90s in Mozambique. And I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Caio. That's very interesting responses to those questions. Maybe we can invite another round of questions and comments, perhaps from others that we haven't heard from so far. I'm seeing if there are any hands. I don't see any hands now. I guess while people are thinking of replies or comments, I'm curious about two things. The one is if you can say something a little bit, I don't know if about the situation currently in Maputo around kind of the sexual practices, sort of gay culture. And then if you can say a little bit about sort of the next steps for your paper. I mean, are you still gathering additional oral history interviews to supplement what you've done so far? And I see there's a hand up from Ariana. I think she wants to interject.
Yes, thanks. Maybe let me just to continue, you know, this conversation as Caio just finished answering my questions. I was just wondering, you know, in terms of the issue of HIV, I know that I don't know about the GDR specifically, but I know that other socialist countries required Africans to test for HIV before they could enter the country. And I wondered if there was any kind of health screening of that kind that happened for workers that were recruited to work in East German factories. Again, you know, it seems that this was probably linked to racialized ideas that HIV coming from Africa rather than I think, a concern with same-sex relations per se. But no, this is really interesting. Just, you know, it doesn't require an answer. I'm just continuing the conversation. And obviously, well, the whole issue with sexual relationships between you know, Mozambican migrants and East Germans, which would have been the same for other Southern African exiles or members of liberation movements, obviously was the issue of children. So partly there's, I think, a moral and maybe racial dimension to this, but the issue that they produced children and then that the men would kind of go back to other countries was a real practical issue to manage. Yeah.
No, yes, yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, I think you're totally right about, you know, the kind of moral and racial fears regarding interracial relationships and what they could produce, right? And I think, you know, it's also, I mentioned that in the paper a little bit, that you know, if you think about the whole literature about the lives of Mozambican workers in East German factories and how they dealt with the discipline in the hostel, it is very surprising to me that, you know, same-sex practices are not mentioned, because they exist in virtually every other situation in which you have same-sex confinement. And there are tons of historical scholarship about that in so many different, so many different contexts. Obviously, you know, that doesn't mean that it happened here because it happened elsewhere. But as I showed in Issa's interview, he does mention that you know, about all sorts of sexual experimentation in the factory setting, some of which in his own narrative had to do with certain difficulties and barriers in accessing women, as he himself tells this story. You know, obviously this can be complicated in many different ways, but just to answer to your comment. And regarding testing, I don't really, certainly there was testing of abilities and also a health screening. I don't know if people were explicitly screened for HIV. Probably they were screened for like a whole bunch of things, but that wasn't part of their memory. You know what I mean? That they will just mention, yeah, I was screened for like medically, but it wasn't part of the public, like HIV wasn't in the radar at this particular moment, at least in the interviews that I've done. And regarding the other question, yeah, I mean, regarding the current situation in Maputo, this is really like a PhD dissertation. So I'm afraid I can't really say much about that, except that as I mentioned, the project, one of the results will be an archival collection that will be hosted at the Gala Queer Archive here in Johannesburg. So over there are, you know, a lot of interviews with a younger generation of queer, gay, lesbians, trans people from Maputo, who, you know, are all telling the stories of how things have changed with mostly with political and economic liberalization, but also with institutionalization of queer struggles by, you know, creating associations, NGOs, and all that. So I think that will be, and obviously technology, the internet, cell phones, that, you know, that I think that is probably the single most impactful change in shaping these networks of queer sociability, because something that is really present in all the interviews that I've carried out with older people from a certain generation, is difficulties in network building. How these networks of queer sociability, they would happen in a very unstructured fashion, sometimes by chance, sometimes by just, looking at someone on the street and then approaching that person, and that person will put you in touch with someone else and someone else and someone else. And this whole process could be very arduous. And I think, social media really revolutionized the ways in which these networks emerge and the ways in which people mobilize friendships, romance, and all of that. And where I'm going with this, I hope that this will be a chapter in a book. So thank you for this platform, because this is the first time I'm presenting this particular chapter, let's call it like that.
Okay, great. There's been a fair amount of attrition. People are having to go on to other workshops and so on. I don't know if you have, I think this is a good moment for us to conclude. If you have any kind of concluding remarks you want to give, any thoughts. I don't see any comments in the chat, people just kind of thanking your replies. Yeah, that's been very interesting. So yeah, this is the moment if you want to conclude the discussion, and then we'll close.
No, I think, that's it. I don't really have anything else to say. Thank you so much for everyone, for the history workshop, for this platform, and for everyone who came. Thank you. It was a great conversation for me.
Fantastic. Okay, great. So this, as all seminars, this one will be uploaded onto the History Workshop YouTube channel in the near future. So look out for it. And there will be an advert for the next talk going out very soon. But thanks again, Caio, for being here, and good luck with the next steps of the book chapter.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. So at this
Bye,
point,
thanks.